But here I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Ankit Kumar at Sheffield Geography, for our ongoing conversations of hopefulness and hopelessness. And I'll be drawing on some of the work we're doing together here. The reason we're working is Ankit describes himself as a hopeless geographer and has challenged me to think more critically about hope and hopelessness interact, so I'm going to reflect on that too. So what do I mean about hope? For me, hope is a form of hopeful action. It's been too often dismissed as potentially naive or crippling. You can see how it might foreclose the possibility of action. In other words, if we have hope, then we might not see any need to change or challenge our current situation or practices. We can just be optimistic that everything will be okay. In particular, in relation to climate change, it's been argued that having hope might mean that we're simply hopeful humans will be okay, despite all evidence to the contrary. This is a very inactive and passive form of hope, and a type of optimistic, wishful thinking. It's a kind of positive emotion that perhaps doesn't actually do anything other than make us feel better about where we're at. I also think it'd be quite individual that we can just say, well, be hopeful, it'll all go away, don't worry about it, and we don't have to think about our relations to other people. It doesn't demand action of the individual, and therefore they have little control over whether their optimism will be released. But instead, I'm interested in hope as an emotion and action, in hopeful action. Rosser argues that hope is the desire for X, a belief that X is possible but not certain, and therefore a mental emphasis on seeking to achieve X. In other words, hope is something that could or might happen if the hoper works towards it. This means that hope requires the hoper to be involved with their hope. It's not something passive. If we're going to have hope, we have to enact and work towards putting into practice what we hope will happen. So they need to have emotions, thoughts, plans and actions that revolve around both the desire and the possibility of it coming about. And this builds on Bloch's articulation of emotion. Hope is an emotion that requires people to actively engage in what is becoming. So in this way, hope is an action, it's a type of agency, and it's a political act. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. Hopeful people are actively engaged with defying or changing the odds, and hope is the fuel for agency. So it's not just wishful thinking, it emboldens us to take action to make that hope manifest. So it's political, it's a type of agency, and it's the most useful articulation of hope when we think about what we need to do around climate justice. So hope is a cognitive pathway which, when collectivised, provides practical ways towards transformative change. It can give us motivation, it can sustain us in this quest towards achieving a demanding goal, even when that goal might feel uncertain and unsure. So it's not about assuming that we know where we're going to get to, it's about putting into practice action that will help us bring that thing into being, even if we're not sure we're going to make it. So West uses the term transformative hope to communicate both the centrality of agency to the concept, but also that the intended outcome is broader social change. So it's about collective hope and hope for all, not about just individually wishing that you're rich. Hope, of course, is risky in the sense that it might slip into that optimism and that wishful thinking. It might hide some of the complexities of where we're at in the world. So hope is always deeply relational and exists in tension with hopelessness, and of course within potentially oppressive social relations and structures. In other words, we can't be naive in our hope and our quest for hopeful action. So hopelessness obviously removes the possibility of action and agency. It's a disillusionment that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're hopeless, then nothing can change. So I'm going to disengage from the possibility of it engaging. But of course, it's important to acknowledge why some people might feel this way, and how and why communities are without hope, and how this course should challenge hopeful approaches to climate change. So Ankit Kumar argues that it's vital we do not ignore the hopelessness of the already marginalised, especially in the global south. Otherwise, we might engage in new forms of climate colonialism. So he outlines how a focus on hopeful action and urgency around climate change might end up creating a sense of universalism, which ignores crucial questions of difference, justice, rights and responsibilities. And of course, if we understand climate change as a universal problem of urgency, then that leaves the space and opportunity to apply technocratic solutions that might smooth over some of those differences. The outcome, of course, is unjust and also likely to benefit those who are already privileged. So if we rely on technological solutions and say, well, we don't have time to discuss some of the democratic issues and to think through the consequences because we're literally 100 seconds to midnight. Well, that was last year, so I don't know where we're at now, probably less. Then actually we will be emboldened to apply solutions that will, of course, have a particularly negative effect on the already marginalised. And it also points out that this sense of urgency around climate change is only really hitting the global north now because we are finally understanding that we are under threat. And for many in the global south, their worlds have already been irreparably changed. So there's a huge disparity in that sense of whose urgency, why now, and how we might use that urgency-lessness as a route to radical justice. For example, expressions of hopelessness towards the status quo could be a powerful mobiliser of alternative actions. This, for example, from Greta Thunberg said, I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. I want you to put into action something urgently. So hopelessness and therefore disengagement with certain practices, a refusal to hope in the current systems of governance, especially global climate governance systems, might come from a belief that this will force a change in the process. And there's some really fascinating work coming out around hopelessness in, for example, parts of Indonesia, where an Australian colleague, Australian geographer, has done work with the communities there around what they think their hopelessness around climate change in the future leads to. And land rights and paternalistic approaches to conservation. So I think if we are perhaps too optimistic and wishful thinking in our hope, then again we manage to avoid dealing with some of the terrible consequences of some environmental thought. And one of the things I have been working on is how exclusion, discrimination and unequal power relations persist in apparently progressive spaces unless they're constantly challenged. So this tension between refusal and engagement is similar to the one I started with, describing environmentalism as being simultaneously resistance and creation. And to me, that's what gives me hope. Not that we should naively say, here's the way that we're going to change the world, but we are constantly in tension between resistance and creating a different way of being. So, in other words, when we invest in hopeful action, we acknowledge that at times hopelessness might also be a powerful response. And hope and hopelessness are always present and in relation to each other. And that also justifies my despair on certain days if I watch too much news, listen to the government too much. What does that hopelessness do? Do I need to reflect on it rather than brush it aside? So I want to now just pass to explore two examples from my research which enables us to unpack these processes of hopeful action. The first one is around learning to work across difference in Australia. So environmentalists have long been accused of prioritising environmental concerns over social justice issues, and so in Australia in particular, ignoring Black and Indigenous needs. So I was interested in how national environmental organisations responded to these Indigenous demands in Australia, particularly when they work on campaigns in the north of the country, Cape York and the Kimberley, regions that have successfully secured, albeit partially, land back to Indigenous ownership and have a growing Indigenous self-determination and leadership. So to do this, I worked with environmental and Indigenous activists, examining their everyday lives and how their political ideologies and campaigns are complicated, tested and refined through practice. In other words, I went to the Kimberley and worked with a load of white environmentalists and saw how they got challenged by Indigenous views the whole time and how that changed not just their views but their practices and how they were involved in their campaigns. In the Kimberley, this involved co-creating economic alternatives. So when objecting to a big industrial development, normally they would just say, well, we'll get rid of the development and then we'll walk away, we've won that campaign. And instead they've realised that they need to provide those alternatives as part of their campaign. Ranger programs, again, kind of more conservation-like rather than activism, because that's what the Indigenous activists said they needed them to do. So they've shifted towards the creation of alternatives that benefit Indigenous people rather than solely focusing on objection and campaigning. And it was through sustained daily lived experience that they developed new forms of inclusive and intersectional environmentalism. And for me, this is a hopeful sign of hopeful action, opening up avenues for different approaches, offering ways to create space to think differently about what environmentalism should do. But of course, there's plenty of work left to be done, so there's two concerns that raise from this. The first is this question of inclusivity. On the left, you've got the Wilderness Society's original type of flyers. Complete absence of people, using the words like wild, had a whole Wild Rivers campaign, even though it was in the Cape York, which is very, very lived in by a range of Indigenous people. So of course, Indigenous people are like, what are you talking about? Wild rivers. We're not even in these pictures, and yet that's our home. So there's a real push to change the way in which language was used. So the Australian Conservation Foundation, which shifted to using terms like people, culture and nature, and not using terms like real wild and wilderness, and putting people at the top of the concern of some of these environmental campaigns, not, as you saw on the last slide, whales. So if you can see how there's a shift in how some of that iconography works. But when these things become tested, there always ends up a gap between the discourse and what these groups said they would do and what they do in practice. And that, I think, is the question that still remains in environmentalism, that they've got better at talking the talk, but actually when it comes down to it, will back an environmental win rather than what they might see as a compromise that provides some social justice outcomes. And one of the reasons this still happens is because privilege amongst environmentalists in Australia remains unanalysed. When I talk to them about whether they felt that they brought privilege to them in their activism, most of them said, oh no, not really. And so they weren't able to recognise their own privilege in race or class or gender, and how that produced ongoing processes of dominance in these negotiations with Indigenous activists. And indeed, one of the things that we need to always analyse in these projects is not just what they might or might not achieve, but what they're lacking, what's missing, what's unsaid, what could be improved. And to me, recognising that these attempts at hopeful action will be imperfect is powerful, but requires us to keep asking questions. The second example is my ongoing work with a variety of eco-communities. For me, this is how environmentalists purposely build and put into practice alternative ways of living, producing, educating, and working. And eco-communities experiment in building new material infrastructures, houses, energy generation, food production, water and sewage systems, and crucially social infrastructures, so how they make collective decision-making, how they share, how they live and work together. So eco-communities are deliberately defined as a broad concept that includes eco-villages, intentional communities, co-housing, and low-impact developments. There are relatively few large examples globally of sort of over 400 people, but you do have Findhorn in Scotland, Damanhar in Italy, Christiana in Denmark, and Auroville in India. But most are much smaller and less well known, and they're between 30 and 100 people. Cider Linden in Germany is 150, Lilac in Leeds has 50 participants, Dancing Rabbit in the USA is 30. So the normal size is actually between 30 and 50 members. And what's interested me recently is increasing numbers of these are urban, so it's not just about a rural retreat. do it yourself, which I really like, that's sharing, and also extended relations of care. So central to collaboration is the sharing of everything: resources, materials, space, skills, and care obligations. And the research recently has showed that it very much improves participants' well-being. So I'm fascinated by eco-communities because they offer numerous forms of hopeful action that we can analyse, and also, of course, they're great to take students to. There are numerous examples of success within these, I would say. So they demonstrate how to build affordable eco-homes. They demonstrate how to build alternative economies based on land-based livelihoods or sharing and self-provision. They demonstrate how energy can be generated through wind, solar and hydro, how food can be provided ecologically, and how to live in an anti-capitalist way amongst capitalism. But again, this raises a couple of concerns. The first is that eco-communities tackle the structural causes of social and environmental problems by building new ones. Those new infrastructures, material and social. So they critique existing capitalist systems quite effectively. And they demonstrate the need and the benefits of building these alternatives collectively, not as individual lifestyle change. But the second concern, and as geographers we should always ask this question, around scale. As in, can community initiatives operate at scale which facilitates broad, regional, or even national level change? So grounded in arguments that are decades old now around the pitfalls of localisation, it's finally being acknowledged that the question of whether projects can be scaled up linearly misunderstands social change. So for a lot of eco-communities, they said, well, they're not relevant until they're big scale. And what I would say is that that's asking the wrong question about how we understand social change to happen and the possibilities of hopeful action. This scalar approach limits our understanding of the possibilities of community initiatives and constantly consigns them to being marginal or niche. My understanding is that scale isn't linear. Actually, rather horizontal connections are made between places and initiatives which inspire these ideas and practices to travel. And we should be exploring how these ideas and practices travel and evolve rather than expecting large-scale versions to develop. So for me, it's in the mobilisation of 1,000 different versions of community action that is hopeful, not in the building of large-scale eco-communities, which in themselves generate their own and new different problems around collectivity and decision-making. But of course, further work is still required on what that means in practice, and one of the gaps in the research around eco-communities is so while scale isn't a linear process, it can have a number of different implications in how we might understand eco-communities and what makes them work and encourages them to be built in the first place. So I did promise I was going to speak for 35 minutes, so I'm going to conclude. I am a hopeful geographer, and so I do think there are many reasons to be hopeful and many examples of collective hopeful action. Hope depends on an ability to imagine a future distinct from the present, the relation to such future to specific events that could be defined as concrete goals, and a real possibility of achieving those goals. And of course, a lot of that requires supporting each other in imagining what that hope and that future might look like. And it's quite easy to slip back into hopelessness. As Ross has said, hope is the desire for X, a belief that X is possible but not certain, and a mental emphasis on seeking to achieve X. So hope is something that might happen if we work towards it through hopeful action. And what is absolutely certain is if we don't work towards it, then we certainly won't make any changes, which is one of the things that I think is vital to understand. But we have to, of course, try and avoid the risks of hope, the naivety and passivity of optimism, and to acknowledge the importance of hopelessness and refusal. And it's vital we engage with hopeful action critically. We always need to understand it as in tension with hopelessness and understand why so many people might have only hopelessness. I think we should believe in the possibility of collective hopeful action, and we should be teaching our students about these possibilities and sharing with them how they already exist in multiple forms. That they're imperfect, unfinished, and at times contested doesn't mean they've failed or that we can't learn anything from them. On the contrary, the only way to support further hopeful action is to learn from what's already happening, empower ourselves and our students to experiment in hopeful action themselves, while also acknowledging why hopelessness exists and what the power of refusal might offer. If you would like more examples of hopeful action, Ankit and I made a film with Time for Geography that's available, very much set in the eco-community at Hockerton in Nottinghamshire, so please feel free to view that. And the other thing that I've made is a comic. Living in an eco-community, which explores some of the tensions and difficulties of living in an eco-community. I've got some spare copies, and the book that was mentioned earlier. And that is it. Thank you.
Well, Jenny, thank you very much indeed. That was just wonderful, wasn't it? So inspiring, hopeful to start with. I asked Jenny to speak for around about 35 minutes, just because I thought it would be great to have some time for some questions before we move on to our reception. So I've got the microphone, and I will run to the part of the room where there might be a question. So I'd like to open the floor now. 2 questions. There's one here.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Jenny, when policymakers are looking for solutions and things they can put into action, they're asking questions about can this scale and how can we roll this out? But that's not the right question. Could you tell us a bit more what you think are the right questions, and from the point of view of decision makers, policymakers, when they're looking at these initiatives, what should they be asking about that?
I think one of the key things that I think they should be asking is, what does this particular place need, and how can we facilitate that community to generate what it needs itself? I think one of the dangers with policymakers wanting, can this be put here and then we'll scale it up, is of course it loses connection to the specifics of place, the specific needs of those different communities, and often will therefore fail. So some of the biggest eco-community fails are when they haven't taken the social infrastructure seriously enough and just said, here's a load of technology, we're going to build these houses and then it will work out. I think we know that communities need support to work together, to decide what they're going to do together, to understand different needs. And so I think, for me, policymakers, as frustrating as it is, need to carry on working on that smaller scale, neighbourhood scale, and say, how can we facilitate change here, that it's going to look different than it will down the road. And that means it's more likely to work.
I just want to ask, we're hearing a lot about teenage mental health in particular. Is that partly due to this feeling of hopelessness about the environment and where the world's going? And by being hopeful, is that a way of turning this around and helping them to cope with their lives as they unfold?
Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching kind of a hopeful geography for many years, but I realised a good decade ago that our students were quite depressed around climate change. They come to university fully aware of what we've done to the planet, and what we were finding was that when we asked them, they said that the geography degrees depressed them further, because they can tell you all the different ways in which the world is ruined. And so we started a module called Ecological Futures, where we said, right, you know all of the stuff about climate change, you know how bad it is. What we're going to do is identify 4 different strategies that might be more hopeful. Of course they're not perfect, but let's go out into the world and have a look at them and just see what you might be able to take from it, without, not being critical. But I think that that seems to have got worse, that climate anxiety. And the last thing I want to do is depress young people. That doesn't seem a good outcome in education. So, yeah, I think it is important that we find in ourselves and communicate what hope we might have. But as I said, Ankit said that he's a hopeless geographer, and I'm not sure he can turn that around. But that's why we're working together, see how we can maybe do that together.
Can I maybe just pick up on that and actually what you were talking about in the conclusion, which is how you might bring hopeful action into the classroom. Many people here are teaching at secondary level, primary level, some people at university. You gave some examples of your own work, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about what you do with your students. But there are some more subtle things there about the kind of language that gets used, and whether that's something that we can all reflect on in our practice.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the language continues to evolve, and now we're at a point where it's quite common to call it a climate emergency, and we talk about multiple crises, and I was writing something the other day and I listed about 10 current global crises, and I think that the word crises and emergency and doom are really quite powerful, and I'm not saying that they're not useful and important politically, but I think one of the things that we can do with students is start at a different point and say, what do you hope for and how might you get there? To me, it's just important to show there are other ways of doing it, but also to get them to put themselves in those places. So in my work on eco-homes, I wanted them to reflect on where they lived. So I didn't want to assume, most of them live in cold, leaky Sheffield houses. And so we talked about the problems of those, and then we talked about what might be possible, what's not possible. But at least I want to recognise where they're at. So I think it's important we recognise how students are feeling, as well as pointing out different ways of doing it.
Thank you. Any other?
Started planting trees in that area. You're nodding because you know all this. But I just think that from about 15, 20 years ago, when we were looking at what citizenship and geography could do together, then why am I, as the geography teacher, also the person who coordinates the recycling, and we talk about planting trees at school? It's all connected with that. And you've given me so much more energy for my role in that. So there's no question, just appreciation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any further questions in the room? I'm thinking there might be one at this end of the room. Has time to say. Okay. Well, Jenny, I wanted to once again say thank you for starting things off for us in such an inspiring and obviously very hopeful way. I think it's great. It really illustrates, I think, the importance of our theme for this conference, thinking about how we can work together to address some of these major planetary crises that we currently face. So, the arrangements for the next part of the evening are as follows. Everybody in the room is invited to complimentary drinks at Kelham Island Museum. And we actually have a coach which will seat 70 people that will be leading from outside of the building. If you head towards the front of the building, people will guide you. It's actually leading from Paternoster Road, for those who know Sheffield. We have 70 seats on that bus. It's actually not very far to walk to Kelham Island Museum. So I'm going to be walking, and our immediate past president, Alan, is in the room somewhere. I know that he knows the routes, as I'm sure many of you do. So we can all follow Alan down to Kelham Island Museum. After the drinks reception, there will be dinner for those people who have booked dinner. But let me just emphasise that everybody is very welcome indeed to join us for the drinks. But before we leave, can we just thank Jenny one more time?